Okay, so have you ever heard that argument, the one that people flee socialist countries but not capitalist ones?
Oh, yeah. It comes up all the time.
It's a really common one.
Yeah.
But is it really that simple?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into this question.
Sounds good.
We'll be looking at it through the lens of an article called Why Do People Flee Capitalist Countries?
Okay.
By Jorge Majfud. Now, Majfud is a Uruguayan-American writer and professor, so he brings a really interesting perspective to the table.
For sure.
Right. So
Yeah.
what's fascinating about Majfud's piece is that he sort of turns the classic argument on his head.
Uh-huh.
He's basically saying that this whole question, this idea that people are fleeing socialism, is kind of flawed from the start.
Right.
It's loaded.
Yeah, it's like it's designed to shut down any real conversation before it even starts.
Exactly.
It's like, boom, case closed.
Yeah, like a mic drop moment. And one of the things Majfud points out is that using these big labels like capitalism and socialism to try to explain migration, well, it's a huge oversimplification.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, think about it. Those terms cover a massive range of different systems.
Yeah. I mean, you can't just lump all capitalist countries together, right?
Exactly.
Like comparing the United States to, say, Peru, you see two totally different economic realities.
Yeah. I mean, their standards of living are worlds apart.
Right.
And then on the other side, you have places like the Scandinavian countries with their, universal health care and these strong social safety nets.
Right. Lots of socialist elements there.
But they thrive within a capitalist framework.
Exactly. So it's not a black and white issue.
Right. It's not like socialist equals bad and capitalist equals good.
No, not at all.
And so the level of, state involvement in the economy and social life, it can vary a lot.
Yeah, there's a whole spectrum there.
Okay, so let's talk about East Germany.
Okay.
Majfud uses it as a kind of case study. A lot of people did flee to West Germany, especially after the Berlin Wall went up.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But Majfud points out that East Germany, the GDR, it also received immigrants.
Oh, interesting.
Which kind of challenges that narrative, right? The narrative of one-way flight from socialism.
Yeah, definitely adds some nuance to the picture.
And speaking of the Berlin Wall, I mean, it's such a potent symbol, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Loaded with so much meaning.
For sure.
I mean, remember that tragic death of the fugitive who was trying to cross it?
Oh, right.
The one that inspired Nino Bravo's song Libre?
Yeah.
It really, I think, underscores the human cost of these divisions.
It really does.
And that human cost is a big part of Majfud's argument.
Yeah.
He's saying that migration is often driven by necessity, right?
Uh-huh.
It's about trying to find a better life.
Absolutely.
Regardless of what the political system is.
It's not always about ideology.
Exactly.
Sometimes it's just about survival.
Yep, people weigh their options and they go where they think they have a chance to thrive.
Totally.
And that's kind of a pragmatic decision, right?
Very much so.
And speaking of pragmatism, Majfud points out that even these, powerful capitalists, right, they haven't always been ideologically pure.
Right.
He points to the example of Henry Ford.
Oh, yeah.
Doing business with both Hitler and Stalin.
Right, during the war.
Yeah.
And this continues today, right?
Exactly.
I mean, we see capitalists engaging with communist China, with autocratic regimes like Saudi Arabia.
So the question is, if powerful capitalists are willing to work with these regimes when it suits their interests, does that kind of expose some hypocrisy in this whole fleeing socialism argument?
It definitely raises some questions. Is ideology really the driving force here?
Right, or is it something else?
Exactly.
And this leads us to Majfud's focus on Latin America, a region, obviously, with a really complex and often turbulent history.
Yeah, for sure.
And his argument is that Latin America has suffered under brutal capitalist dictatorships, many of which were backed by the United States.
Right.
And these regimes forced tons of people into exile.
Yeah, all kinds of people.
From professionals to, the impoverished.
Everyone.
And this directly contradicts the idea that it's only socialist regimes that create refugees.
Right. It flips the script.
In fact, Majfud highlights this really startling statistic. With the exception of Cuba, nearly all Latin American exiles fled capitalist dictatorships, not communist ones.
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
So the question is, how did the U.S. get so involved in supporting these regimes?
Yeah, especially during the Cold War.
It's a complicated story, but the fear of communism played a huge role.
Oh, absolutely.
It was used to justify interventions, to prop up these dictators, even if they were brutal and oppressive.
Right. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
And one disturbing example is the School of the Americas.
Oh, yeah.
which is now known as the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. The U.S. trained a lot of Latin American military leaders there, and some of those guys went on to commit horrific human rights abuses.
Right, it's a dark chapter.
Yeah, it really is.
It just shows how ideology, power, and migration are all intertwined.
And it shows that we need to really think critically about these historical events.
For sure, yeah.
So let's bring things closer to the present.
Okay.
Majfud compares what's happening in Venezuela and Colombia today.
Right, two very different situations.
Yeah, he acknowledges that there's a refugee crisis in Venezuela. And, of course, it's often labeled as a socialist dictatorship.
Right, that's the narrative.
But he emphasizes that the scale of displacement in Venezuela, it doesn't actually exceed that of Colombia.
Interesting.
Colombia isn't generally considered a socialist country.
No, not at all.
So what's happening there?
Well, the Colombian conflict it's incredibly complex.
Yeah, it's been going on for decades.
And right-wing paramilitary groups, they've played a huge role in the violence. Majfud's point is that this conflict, which is often overlooked, is responsible for a massive number of victims.
Right. And it kind of gets overshadowed by the focus on Venezuela.
Exactly.
And then, of course, you have the U.S. involvement in Colombia as well, right?
Yeah, through things like Plan Colombia.
And the impact of the drug war.
Right. It's all connected.
So it's not as simple as, some people might suggest.
No, not at all.
Majfud uses this term capitalist dictatorships to describe some of these regimes. And that might sound kind of politically charged to some people.
Yeah, it definitely has some bite to it.
But he explains that these military and paramilitary regimes, they were really functioning to protect large-scale capital and foreign investments.
Right. They were serving the interests of the powerful.
And that ties back to the Cold War, right?
Yeah, the fight against communism was often a cover for economic interests.
That makes me think of the United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita Brands International.
Oh, yeah, in Guatemala.
They benefited tremendously from these regimes, even while the people were suffering.
It's a classic example of how corporate interests and political power can align.
Yeah, and how that can have devastating consequences for ordinary people.
For sure.
So where does this all leave us? What's Majfud's main point?
I think his main point is that the dominant power, in this case the United States, shapes the narrative.
Okay.
Any alternative to their dominance, it gets labeled as failing and authoritarian.
Even if the reality is more complex.
Exactly.
He's basically saying that the dominant power gets to decide what works and what doesn't.
Right. They control the story.
And they present any challenge to their authority as a failure, which then reinforces their narrative.
It's a way of maintaining power.
Okay, so we've seen how Majfud kind of deconstructs this whole fleeing socialism narrative.
Yeah, he really picks it apart.
And he highlights how power dynamics play a huge role in shaping our perceptions of these issues.
For sure.
What does this mean for us? What should we take away from this?
I think the takeaway is that we can't just accept easy answers and simplistic narratives.
Right.
When you hear that people are fleeing socialist countries, ask yourself, what's the full story?
Yeah.
Who benefits from this narrative?
Good question.
What other factors might be at play?
Right. We need to be way more critical of the information we're consuming.
Absolutely.
Especially when it's coming from sources that have a vested interest in a particular narrative.
It's about being informed and discerning.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation.
It has.
It's clear that the reasons people migrate are really complicated.
For sure.
And it's about poverty, it's about violence, it's about opportunity, and yes, sometimes it's about political ideology.
You're right.
But it's rarely as simple as that fleeing socialism narrative would have us believe.
Absolutely.
So what are we going to dive into in part 2?
Well, Majfud doesn't stop there.
Oh, good.
He goes on to examine specific examples like Haiti and Honduras. To illustrate his points and those stories, they add even more depth and nuance to this conversation.
That was good.
And that's exactly what we'll be exploring next time.
All right, well, stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
We'll be right back after a short break.
Sounds good. So, Majfud makes this really interesting point in his article.
Okay.
He argues that the United States actually has more socialist programs than many of the capitalist countries in Latin America or Africa.
Wow, that's a bold statement.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure.
What exactly does he mean?
Well, I think he's challenging us to think critically about how we define and label these systems, right? Like what makes a program socialist? It's pretty subjective.
Yeah.
It really depends on the context.
For sure.
But he's pointing out that the U.S. has things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid.
Right.
These are social safety net programs that are often associated with, socialist ideals.
Okay.
But the U.S. very much identifies as capitalist.
Right. So it's kind of a contradiction.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
Like these labels get thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
Maybe even as political weapons.
I think that's part of his point.
Okay, so let's dig into some of his case studies.
Okay, it sounds good.
Starting with Haiti.
All right.
What's the story there?
So Majfud focuses on the period after the Duvalier dictatorship.
Right, a brutal regime.
Brutal, yeah, marked by a lot of violence and instability.
Okay.
There were even death squads operating in the country.
Wow, so a really horrific situation.
It was.
Yeah.
And in the midst of all this chaos, you have this democratically elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, emerge.
Okay.
But guess what?
Right.
He's overthrown.
Oh, wow.
Not once, but twice.
Oh, they.
In coups that were backed by the United States.
Wait, so the U.S. supported the overthrow of a democratically elected leader?
Yep.
Why?
It's a complicated story,
Okay.
but it highlights how the U.S. has often intervened in other countries' affairs, even when it meant undermining democracy.
Mm.
In Haiti's case, Aristide was seen as a threat by certain powerful interests.
I see.
And the U.S. ultimately sided with those interests.
So it wasn't really about supporting democracy.
Not in this case.
It was about something else.
Yeah, it's about power.
This is all pretty disturbing.
It is.
It makes you wonder about the real motives behind these interventions.
For sure.
Okay. So, and it gets even more complex when you consider the economic side of things.
Right.
Haiti's economy, which relied heavily on rice production, was severely damaged by U.S. policies.
Yeah, this is a key part of Majfud's argument.
How so?
Well, he points to Bill Clinton,
Okay.
who later admitted his mistake. But essentially, Clinton forced Haiti to lower tariffs on rice imports,
Oh, wow.
which flooded the market with cheaper, subsidized rice from the U.S.
So Haitian farmers couldn't compete.
Exactly. It devastated their livelihoods
Yeah.
and contributed to Haiti's economic struggles.
It's a reminder that the forces driving migration are often beyond individual choice.
Absolutely.
People are fleeing desperate situations,
Trying to survive.
seeking a better life for themselves and their families.
Yeah.
It's not always about ideology.
Right.
Okay, so we've seen how things played out in Haiti. What about Honduras?
Okay, so Majfud focuses on the aftermath of the 2009 coup against President Manuel Zelaya,
Right.
which, get this, originated from the U.S. military base in Honduras.
Hold on. A coup that originated from a U.S. military base.
Yeah.
What was the reason for that?
Well, it was triggered by Zelaya's attempt to hold a referendum on constitutional reform.
Okay.
This was perceived as a threat by some powerful interests,
I see.
and they moved to remove him from power.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because a U.S. ally later carried out a similar reform for their own benefit,
Right.
and there was little resistance.
Exactly. Double standards.
Yeah.
Powerful nations can get away with things that smaller countries can't.
So it seems like Majfud is building a case here,
Yeah.
that it doesn't really matter if a country is socialist, capitalist, or even, as he says, Nazi.
Right.
The dominant power, the U.S., will control the narrative.
They'll label any alternative to their dominance as a failure.
Right.
Even if the reality is more complex.
And he uses this really powerful phrase.
Oh, yeah.
Facts are forced to fit the narrative.
It's chilling, isn't it?
It
It
is.
shows how information can be manipulated.
And how public perception can be shaped.
Yeah, it's a reminder to be vigilant,
To be critical.
to question the information we're given.
Especially when it's coming from sources that have a vested interest in a particular narrative.
Absolutely.
So are we getting the full story?
That's the question.
Or just a simplified, biased version of events?
I think that's something we should always be asking ourselves.
Yeah.
We need to seek out diverse sources of information
Right.
and be aware of the potential biases that might be shaping the narratives we encounter.
It's not about blindly accepting the dominant narrative.
Right.
It's about digging deeper
Doing your own research.
and being willing to challenge your assumptions.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see a pattern here.
Oh, yeah.
Like Majfud is saying that the very act of resistance to this dominant power is what gets framed as the problem.
That's a great observation.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
They create the conditions for instability and then point to that instability as proof that the alternative system is flawed.
It's a clever tactic, if a bit insidious.
This is heavy stuff.
It is.
Majfud doesn't pull any punches.
Nope.
He's challenging us to think critically about the world around us
Yeah.
and to question the narratives we've been fed.
Absolutely.
His argument is that countries that don't align with the dominant power will be crushed.
Uh-huh.
and then presented as an example of why their system doesn't work.
Right, like a cautionary tale.
And he also seems to be suggesting that those countries' strategies for self-preservation are often labeled as authoritarianism and oppression.
Oh, yeah.
It's like they're damned if they do and damned if they don't.
Exactly.
It's up to us to look deeper
Yeah.
and question those easy labels.
See the nuances.
Are we seeing the whole picture?
Right.
Or are we being manipulated by a narrative designed to serve the interests of the powerful?
That's the question.
There's a lot to unpack.
It is.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
But Majfud's article raises even more questions.
Oh, yeah.
It's a deep dive in every sense of the word.
For sure.
And there's more to come.
Stay tuned.
All right, so we spent the last 2 parts talking with you about Haiti and Honduras and how their stories challenge the fleeing socialism narrative.
Yeah, they really make you think.
So what are some key takeaways from those examples?
Well, one thing that stands out is how U.S. foreign policy and economic interests have often played a role in creating the very conditions that drive people to migrate. It's not always just about what's happening inside those countries.
Right.
There are external forces shaping their realities.
Yeah, like this chain reaction.
Exactly.
The U.S. intervenes, often for its own strategic or economic reasons, and that creates instability, poverty, violence.
Yeah.
And then people flee.
Right.
And it gets framed as, oh, look, their system is failing.
Right, conveniently ignoring the U.S. role in the whole thing.
So it's a way of deflecting responsibility.
I think so.
It perpetuates this idea that the U.S. system is superior.
Yeah, even when its actions are contributing to the problems.
And Majfud really emphasizes that any country that doesn't align with the U.S. vision will be undermined and used as a cautionary tale.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Okay.
They create the conditions for failure and then point to that failure as proof that their way is the only way.
So where does that leave us?
That's the big question.
What can we do with this information?
Well, I think Majfud is issuing a call to action.
Okay.
He's challenging us to be more informed, more critical, more engaged citizens.
And he encourages us to do our own research.
Yeah.
On examples like Haiti and Honduras.
To see these complexities firsthand.
What are some good resources or starting points for people who want to learn more?
Well, there are some great organizations doing work on this, like the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR.
CEPR, got it.
They do some really insightful work on Latin America and U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
The National Security Archive at George Washington University also has a ton of declassified documents.
Interesting.
That shed light on these historical events.
And of course, there are tons of books and articles and documentaries out there.
Oh, yeah, plenty of resources if you're willing to look.
So really, it's about going beyond the headlines.
For sure.
And digging deeper.
Absolutely.
This has been a really insightful deep dive.
Yeah.
We've really unpacked this whole fleeing socialism narrative.
Yeah, it's way more complicated than it seems at first glance.
It's about poverty, violence, opportunity.
Climate change.
And yes, sometimes it's about political ideology, but
it's rarely that simple.
Right, we need to understand the historical context, the role of powerful actors.
And how these narratives get shaped.
Well said.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
I agree.
And to our listeners, we hope this has given you a lot to think about.
Keep questioning.
Don't forget to share your thoughts and continue the conversation on social media.
Yeah, let's keep the discussion going.
Using our episode hashtag.
We'd love to hear from you.
Until next time, keep diving deep.
See you then.